Hello, Hannah.
Hi.
Hello. Are you in Mr. Klapka's class?
Yeah, I'm an online student in his fourth period class.
Oh, okay. Good, good.
And he told us to join early, so that's what I'm doing.
Okay, well, that's good. Good to have you with us.
Thank you for coming to talk to our class today.
Oh, it should be fun. Yeah, yeah. So what have you learned so far?
A lot. There have been a lot of notes and stuff we've learned.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So much.
There's a lot. Yeah, it's a big story. So it's
yeah. Because we've already gone over 5 chapters.
Oh my
it's already
goodness.
been so much.
Wow, wow.
And we're on our 6th one now.
Wow, wow. Now, what is your favorite subject? Hello, Carly.
Mine is math. I like math the best because I'm best at it.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah.
And I understand it more than any other subject.
Yeah, good. Now, how is it going doing things online?
Yeah, I like it better because I was doing it in school, but then I just couldn't. I would get like stomach aches every morning when I went.
Really?
So then I just stopped going.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's way better online.
Yeah, it works better for a lot of people. I know I've been doing online classes for a long time, but also in person, and different people like different ways of doing this. So
yeah.
Hello, Carly. Now, you live in Largo or in one of the surrounding areas?
I live in St. Pete.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes it convenient. So yeah.
Yeah.
Now, are you able to choose? Yes, I can hear you, Carly. How are you doing?
Hi.
Oh, and there's Mr. Klapka.
There we go. Hi, Bob.
Hello.
Oh, hang on. Done? Okay. Hey, you can chat on Monday. Don't worry about it. Here. I'm wearing my Paul Revere t-shirt.
Oh, great. Very good.
Yes, got that. And I got one other thing here. Hi, guys. Hi, guys. You want? We'll take care of that later. Okay, no problem. There, got mine. Revere t-shirt on.
Love that.
And
Oh,
everybody say hi, Dr. Allison.
Hello, hello.
And I got this.
Oh, great. Yeah, Dorchester Heights.
And my Dorchester Heights scarf. Although
Yes.
it's only 80 degrees here, so it's not quite warm enough, but
Yeah.
I can look cool. Okay, we got some good questions here.
Well, that is good. That is good.
do you like my question?
I hope I have the answers.
Well, if you don't, I don't know who will. Because, yeah, please don't defer to me.
Okay.
Okay, I got the lights down in the room so the kids in the classroom can see the screen a little
Okay.
easier.
Good.
Okay?
That's good. However it works best for you.
Right. So I think what we'll do is, we'll just sit here for the time being. Too much glare.
Right on camera.
What I think what we'll do is, like I said to you, I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the students.
Okay.
And we can go till about 10:45.
Okay.
So that'll be good. That'll give me a couple minutes because they've got an assessment on Monday that I want to just cover a couple quick things with them.
Now, when you say assessment, what exactly do you mean?
Like a task.
Oh, okay. That's what we used to call tests. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Didn't mean to throw anyone if
No
there
problem.
was more anxiety about the test.
A number of the questions deal with. You can hear me all right through this.
I can
right?
hear you fine. I can hear you.
Okay, good. A number of the questions, focus in on Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Some of them are hitting a similar subject, and then there's some that are Boston specific to the American Revolution, and a few others are general.
Okay.
Kind of printing them all out. They're really good.
Good.
And I just got printed these out. I was out yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
so I've just had a chance to kind of look at these things briefly. So I'm just kind of quickly put them in order. So
Okay. Good.
we're gonna have a very organic ebb and flow to this.
I hope so.
Yes, absolutely.
If not, you'll know who to blame.
Yeah, absolutely.
That guy's not coming back.
Okay. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, we're missing a few from the. By the way, if anybody, hang on a second here. If anybody gets a text from anybody in the course and they don't know where they're supposed to go, you can text them that number. That's the contact number for Zoom. Okay, we got everybody here, seemingly. Okay, now, one thing I would suggest to both students at home and students here, if you got something to take notes on, that probably would be a good idea, because who knows, I'm kind of silly that way where I might give you something that he talks about for Monday or for future reference. So chapter 6 and all that sort of good stuff. And again, for those of you that are just joining or have, I went and saw Dr. Allison, Bob, a year ago last May, and he graciously gave me this one from South Boston talking about the Battle of Dorchester Heights in March. St. Patrick's Day, 1776, which is the same day my son was born. Well, not
Really?
76, but
Really? Good birthday.
So anyway, okay. So everybody, this is Dr. Allison. I'm going to let him introduce himself, give you a little bit of background, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go directly into questions that you very nicely gave me and whatnot. If at any point during the course of this discussion that you want to interject, either those of you at home or those of us in the studio audience, as I like to refer to them. Let me flip that over. kind of cool. Feel free to jump right in. Dr. Allison is more than willing to take whatever questions you have. And let's get started.
Great. Very good. Well, thank you, Mr. Klapka. Thanks for having me in. And it just seems like yesterday that Mr. Klapka and I were sitting in a classroom, like actually a lot older than the one you're sitting in Clearwater. And both of us had a really great history teacher. And both of us, I think, already were really interested in history. We loved talking about it. And then
yes, we can't forget Jim Jones.
Jim Jones, yes, the legendary Jim Jones. And then Mr. Klapka and I went our separate ways, but continued pursuing history. And he very happily has been teaching in the Pinellas County schools all these years, inspiring other students with history. And I wound up just briefly, dropped out of college, went back to college, got a PhD, and have been teaching for longer than any of you have been alive now at Suffolk University in Boston, as well as in the Harvard Extension School. And I'm fortunate enough to live in a place that has a lot of history and been able to write about history and teach history. So that's what I do. I've written a lot about the Revolution, and I'm involved now with a group called Revolution 250 because we realized, you know, Mr. Klapka and I really care about history all the time, but a lot of people like an anniversary with a round number. So we realized the 250th anniversaries of independence are coming up, and we should do things to prepare for it. As you've been knowing, as you've been reading, a lot of this happened in Boston, and we have a proprietary interest in the story of the Revolution. And we like to say that the Revolution happened in Boston, and then they went to Philadelphia to fill out the paperwork. And that is essentially the story. So we realized we have a story to tell. So we got together the 60 some odd history groups in and around Boston to figure out ways to tell this story better. And there's a USA 250 commission, and the American Association of State and Local History has a 250th program that I know Mr. Klapka has been working on. So that's me, and I did live until fairly recently in South Boston in the shadow of Dorchester Heights, which was, of course, the site of the first American victory in the War for Independence, and have now moved to another neighborhood in Boston. As I've just indicated, I'm not originally from Boston, but have lived here longer than I lived anywhere else, and that's the story of my life, probably more than you wanted to know. So, what are your questions?
Well, let's get started because you talked about, you know, everything started in Boston. They filled out the paperwork. So I've got a couple questions here, and I'm going to combine this. This is from Jordan and Alyssa, and I'll give you both questions, but they're essentially asking the same thing. What was special about Boston that made it the figurehead for the Revolution in America? And the other question is, what made Boston such a powerhouse when it comes to the start of the American Revolution, as opposed to any other place in the colonies?
It's a very good question. And it's something, of course, I've been giving some thought to. Boston was still one of the largest cities in British North America. It had about, its population had reached about 12,000 in 1700, and then it kind of stuck there. Philadelphia, New York, Philadelphia had already surpassed it by this time, New York had. It was involved in trade, a lot of merchants, and a lot of trade with other parts of the world. Also a very literate population. You know, there are more printing presses in Boston than in all of the other colonies put together. And also a lot has to do with the religious background. In 1750, there's a congregational minister in town, Jonathan Mayhew, who gets this inkling that the Anglican Church in Boston is going to commemorate the Saint's Day of Saint King Charles I, who's a saint in the Anglican calendar. The Congregationalists didn't believe in saints. So he preaches a series of sermons about why you should not venerate Charles I. And he says because he was a bad king. And the big question he raises is, who gets to decide whether someone is a good king or a bad king? And his message to his congregation is, the people who are governed do. This is a fundamental idea in Boston, that you judge those who are in power and you control those who are in power. And the people in Boston, the people in Massachusetts have more control over their own lives than anyone else in the British Empire. I'll just tell you one brief story that kind of illustrates this. in the middle of the 19th century, a young historian in one of the towns in Massachusetts hears that there is a guy living in the town who had answered the alarm at Lexington in April of 1775. So he's someone like me or Mr. Klapka who really wants to know, well, what made this guy want to go fight? It's what we would have wanted to know. So he goes to interview this old veteran. He says, well, what was it that made you take up arms? And he says, was it the Stamp Act? And the guy said, I don't think the stamps ever were unloaded. Well, was it the Tea Act? And he said, I never drank tea. Was it the Intolerable Acts? And he said, I didn't know anything about them, never heard of them. Well, what was it then? These are the things the young historian had learned, just as you've learned them, but meant nothing to this veteran. He said, well, what was it then? And he said, we had always governed ourselves. They weren't going to let us do that anymore, and we had to stop that from happening. So it really is an idea of self-government that they have, and it's both what makes them a powerhouse, as one of you said, and also what leads them into revolution when the British Empire starts changing the rules about how they'll be governed.
Okay, very good. And that's, you know, something that we've been looking at closely here. I've got one here from Lauren. And so we know that the colonists were upset with the Stamp Act that was enforced on them, but did they ever talk about their opinion on the fact that the tax was only imposed upon them?
Yes, good question. Yes, they did. They had a good sense of fairness. And the fundamental thing, though, is can they be taxed without their consent? And that becomes the fundamental issue, less so than, hey, we're paying this tax, others aren't. Because actually, in the great scheme of things, they are taxed much less than people in England are. Something that Parliament recognized, something people in England recognize. They think, well, why are they complaining about such a small tax, since they don't pay any other taxes? But it really is the principle of taxation without representation. If there were bumper stickers in 1765, you would have seen that on a lot of them. The taxation without representation is tyranny. And in fact, sometimes I have seen that line attributed to Jonathan Mayhew, that same minister I mentioned, who was upset with Charles I being venerated.
Okay, let's get into the Boston central points here. Boston Massacre. First question is, do you think the Boston Massacre was wrongly labeled? And if so, why? And why were the soldiers of the Boston Massacre found not guilty? And that's from Kendall and Lucia.
Those are both excellent questions. And let me see, I thought I had a background of the massacre. Yes. Yes, it's wrongly labeled. And it is a piece of propaganda. In 1768 in England, there was a massacre. Supporters of John Wilkes, a radical member of Parliament, held in jail. People rally around the jail. British troops arrive, shoot into the crowd. We don't know how many people died, but it is labeled the St. George's Field Massacre. When the troops arrived in Boston in October of 1768, Benjamin Franklin said, sending troops to keep the peace in Boston is like setting up a blacksmith's forge in a gunpowder magazine. And Samuel Adams already began talking about the troops are likely to create a massacre. So you already have this idea that the troops are going to cause trouble, and then nothing happens. And then you have this event in March of 1770. I've always often find students are disappointed only 5 people died, and they think a massacre should have more. If you were one of those 5, you probably would think differently. But yeah, the town labels it a massacre because they're trying to show that the British Crown is wrong by having the soldiers here. And that is a very important thing, part of the town's propaganda campaign. Samuel Adams said that putting your enemy in the wrong and keeping him in the wrong is a very important rule in politics and in war. So then these soldiers then are arrested and charged with murder because they had fired into an unarmed crowd. And that's against the law. So they're prosecuted actually in the name of the king. The case is Rex versus Preston for the captain, Captain Preston, and Rex versus Wemms for Corporal Wemms and the 7 soldiers. And 2 of the leading patriots take on the defense, John Adams and Josiah Quincy. And they take on the defense, excuse me, because British troops are here because Boston is a lawless place, a place that can't be governed. So you need these troops to enforce the law. And Adams and Quincy want to show that even soldiers who fire at an unarmed crowd of civilians can get a fair trial in Boston. So what they're doing is a lot of people in town simply want to hang these guys, Samuel Adams among them, because they've committed this atrocity. But Adams and Quincy conduct their defense, arguing that the soldiers were under attack and convincing the jury that the soldiers were under attack. And Adams, in his closing argument for the defense, it's a wonderful argument he makes about the law, says that facts are stubborn things. The law must be inexorable to the pleadings and lamentations of the prisoners, but it must be deaf as an adder to the cries and lamentations of the populace. That he knows that the mob outside wants to hang these guys, but the law has to show that these guys fired without provocation. And actually, this is the first time in legal history that the phrase "beyond a reasonable doubt" is used. So all of the soldiers except two are found innocent. Two of them, Private Montgomery and Private Kilroy, actually were shown to have been standing right in front and firing into the crowd. And here's another piece for those of you who want to become lawyers. You have 8 soldiers, 1 captain, all charged with killing 5 people. Well, how do you show whose bullet hit whom? And so Montgomery and Kilroy were standing right in front, and that's where Addicks and Gray were standing. So you can show their bullets actually did hit these guys. They're found guilty of manslaughter. That is, the jury accepts the argument that they were under attack, as Adams really had made clear. Adams puts this Boston mob on trial. And these are the supporters of the Patriot movement. It's really a risky thing to do. And manslaughter, by the way, is still an offense that could hang you in this period. So the technical thing Adams does is plead benefit of clergy. And this is a long-standing tradition. If you're able to read in the British world, you could not be tried except by an ecclesiastical court because the presumption is you're a minister. You can only plead benefit of clergy once. So these 2 guys then are branded on their thumbs and then sent to join the rest of the regiment in New Jersey. Sometimes I think being branded and sent to New Jersey is probably more of a punishment than anyone deserves, but that's it. It's really because Adams and Quincy are trying to demonstrate that you don't need troops here because we are a law-abiding people. And, you know, it's really an important issue today, of course, when we see juries making decisions that crowds outside don't like. But there's a reason we have laws. And it's one of the really fundamental things they're trying to protect in the revolution.
Okay, going from the massacre to the Tea Party. Okay, Adriana wants to know, why did colonists dress as Indians when dumping the tea into the harbor rather than just openly stating that they were colonists revolting against unprecedented taxes?
Well, that is a very good question. And partly it's because they disguised themselves because they did not want to be recognized. That is, if they had openly done this and said, here we are, everyone would have said, oh, I saw you there. In fact, the next day, Governor Hutchinson wants to arrest these people. But again, they all had been in disguise, and they made a point of not actually talking so their voices couldn't be recognized. Much later, people do come up with lists of people who were there. But we don't know definitively. And it's also unclear, at different times you'll see the costumes characterized differently. In one case, they're called Mohawks. Other times they're called this non-existent group of Indians. But typically they smeared their faces with some kind of paint and then threw blankets over themselves just so they couldn't be recognized. They know what they're doing is a very important thing, a very serious thing. By the way, they don't call it the Tea Party until after the Revolution, because the Tea Party sounds like kind of a frivolous thing. They called it the destruction of the tea.
And Noah wants to know, other than the Tea Act, was there anything else that led up to the Boston Tea Party?
Yes, actually. The Tea Party is kind of this big, colorful event that we love to talk about. But in the great scheme of things, I don't know if you were sitting around in 1773, if you would say the Tea Party is the big thing. There's actually a long background to this. And in Massachusetts, one of the reasons it's such a big deal is there's a fight going on between the Assembly in Massachusetts and the governor. Governor Thomas Hutchinson opened the Assembly in 1773, basically telling them, things were relatively calm. After the massacre, things calmed down. Samuel Adams is using this time to organize the committees of correspondence and so on, but there's not a lot happening. And Hutchinson opens the Assembly thinking, okay, things are calm. This will be a good time to explain to the Assembly what their role is in the British Empire. And their role in the British Empire is not a very big one. The Assembly in Massachusetts does not govern Massachusetts. The Parliament of Great Britain does. Parliament governs the whole empire. And he says, you either have to accept that idea or you have to declare your independence. And he says, if you're independent, you're not going to be independent for long because the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, the French Empire will come in and govern you. And then you'll lament that you lost your place as members of the British Empire where you have all these freedoms. Okay, members of the Assembly don't really like this because they're being told, essentially, you don't get to decide things, the Parliament does. So they demand that Hutchinson be recalled and replaced with another governor, someone the Assembly can control. And so they asked their agent in London, Benjamin Franklin, to get the Privy Council to sack Hutchinson, send another governor. So Franklin puts this on the agenda of the Privy Council. It's going to make this decision in January. Who is governor of Massachusetts? It's not a big issue for members of the Privy Council. They have a lot of other things to talk about between now and January. Meanwhile, Thomas Hutchinson had been writing to folks in England about members of Parliament and others who wanted to know how come people in Massachusetts are so upset with things like the Stamp Act and these other laws. So Hutchinson really unburdened himself to these folks, talking about how misguided these people were. And those letters happened to fall into Benjamin Franklin's hands. Here you have Thomas Hutchinson writing to members of Parliament about what he thinks about other people in Massachusetts. There's a warning in here about using social media, and Hutchinson wasn't. He was writing private letters, which Franklin gets. Franklin sends them to Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams and the Massachusetts Assembly, who've been trying to get Hutchinson now, have all this evidence. They publish these things, pretty much ruins Thomas Hutchinson as governor. So this is kind of the background in Massachusetts. No one is thinking about tea. And then in May, Parliament passes the Tea Act, not because they're thinking about Massachusetts, but because they're thinking about the East India Company, largest corporation in the world. And it has gone bankrupt. It's on the brink of bankruptcy, having taken over much of India. And Parliament gives them a bailout. Says, okay, we'll give you 15 million pounds. The Prime Minister gets to appoint the board of directors, plus you'll be able to ship your tea to North America. And so it's really the corporate bailout of the East India Company that infuriates people here, mainly the merchants in tea, who now are cut out. And the only tea available is going to come from the East India Company. And it's actually the merchants in Philadelphia, and they are really worried. Okay, we might agree not to buy any tea, but then we know those New Englanders probably will, because they thought New Englanders were duplicitous people, a bunch of religious fanatics and hypocrites. And the term Yankee usually was a term of opprobrium, shrewd dealers and so on. Anyway, the tea, the thing that gets people upset about the tea is it's a monopoly given to the East India Company. And if we allow this to happen, it means we're being governed by the East India Company. And the company is going to become an empire. In fact, there's a pamphlet by John Dickinson about, look what's happened with the East India Company governing Bengal. And Bengal now has had a famine for the last 3 years, but they're still producing tea for the East India Company to export. By the way, there's a really interesting series of films about this kind of idea about a corporation becoming an empire and stifling liberty of the good people. It came out about the time of the bicentennial in the 1970s, called Star Wars, which is about this company becoming an empire. George Lucas, who made Star Wars, was a great student of the American Revolution. He makes it as Star Wars in many ways is an allegory about this, but that's a subject for another day. If you mention Darth Vader and the Jedi in your assessments, I don't know if Mr. Klapka will give you credit or not, but you can cite me as your source.
If they quote you, if they cite you, I probably would. Okay. What was the specific function or intended purpose of the original Boston Committee of Correspondence?
Very good question.
And that's from David.
Okay, David. Very good question. Samuel Adams was the clerk of the Boston Town Meeting. He was really a power in the Boston Town Meeting. And this is an official body. This is the governing body for the town of Boston. Every adult Protestant, tax-paying man over the age of 21 was a member of the town meeting. And in one sense, this is a direct democracy. In another sense, of course, if you've ever been to a town meeting, if you go into a big meeting expecting that we're going to begin just kind of talking generally about the issues, you should know that there have been other people already planning. And so Samuel Adams had inherited from his father a series of caucuses that were going to get together before the meeting, decide what the agenda would be, whom they would elect to office, and so on. So the town meeting is a democratic body, but it does have these different interests there. And everyone voted in the town meeting, by the way, by standing up. So everyone knows how you vote. These are kind of just background things, but the Committee of Correspondence is created by the Boston Town Meeting to correspond with other towns. And each town meeting will form a Committee of Correspondence. And this is a way of keeping in touch. And the real thing it's doing is making sure that the message they get in the other towns in Massachusetts is what Samuel Adams and his allies in the town meeting want them to get. That is, the version of events as presented by Samuel Adams, James Otis, other members of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. Then Adams also is clerk of the Massachusetts Assembly, and he has the Assembly create a Committee of Correspondence to correspond with the other colonies. There was no mechanism before this for the colonial assemblies to correspond with each other. Governors could correspond with each other, but the assemblies couldn't. And in fact, this is one of the big events in 1767, when Parliament creates these different tax laws you've probably heard about, and sends over customs commissioners. And the Massachusetts Assembly sends a circular letter to the other colonial assemblies saying, we all need to resist this. And the governor in Massachusetts orders them to rescind the letter, call it back. And they vote against doing that. The vote is 92 against rescinding, 17 in favor. And the governor then suspends the assembly because the assembly has no business corresponding with others. And then the other governors also suspend their assemblies. And by the way, 1767, with the governor ordering the assembly to rescind the letter, is one of these big events. Paul Revere makes a silver bowl, a punch bowl for the Sons of Liberty in honor of the 92 members of the assembly who voted not to rescind the governor's letter. So just to get back to David's question, the Committee of Correspondence is a way of creating a permanent way for these colonies to correspond with each other.
As an outgrowth of the Boston Tea Party, Isabella wants to know, out of the 4 coercive acts, what did the Port Bill and the New Quartering Act do during the independence process? So how did that push it forward?
Very good question. What here in Massachusetts they call the intolerable acts, which are called the coercive acts in England. They're meant to coerce Massachusetts out of rebelling. They shut down the port, suspend the government of Massachusetts, order Boston to repay the fees, and also the Quartering Act, which was never actually enforced. And it does prevent private soldiers from being quartered in people's homes. And if you can think about it, if you are a soldier sent to keep an eye on people you know to be rebellious, how easily would you sleep if you're sleeping in someone's house? So the Quartering Act is not in practice as big a deal as it is in theory. The other ones that suspend the government replace, mild-mannered Thomas Hutchinson, who Massachusetts wanted to get rid of, with General Gage, military officer, suspends the assembly. And it really does stop the government of Massachusetts. And this is why then Massachusetts wants the other colonies to come to her aid with a Continental Congress. So the big thing that happens is the empire strikes back in 1774. And the folks resisting say, well, we need now to get support from the other colonies. And so this is how the Continental Congress comes into being. The delegates in the Massachusetts Assembly are passing a measure to send delegates to this Congress they want to have, as the governor has sent his secretary to tell the Assembly they're out of business. He's suspending them. They lock the door. So he's actually nailing to the door this proclamation that they are suspended while they're choosing delegates to go to the Continental Congress. So those things really precipitate the colonists into meeting in this Congress, which is still a risky thing. Maybe the other colonies will say, yeah, you people in Massachusetts really pushed it too far this time. We don't, they've shut down Boston. We don't want them to shut down Philadelphia, New York, Charlestown. But instead, Massachusetts does get the others to go along with them, which John Adams calls it the happiest day of his life, when Congress votes to support Massachusetts. So that's really are the things that precipitate the next step the colonists take. What you really need to think about as you're looking at these things, which it's easy enough just to look at as a sequence of events, is imagining that this step didn't happen, or imagining a different response. Had the colonists said, no, we don't want to have anything to do with Massachusetts after all, or had the British Crown, in 1774, there's an election going on for Parliament. Imagine if the opposition had won, and the opposition is running saying the North Ministry has really pushed these people to the brink of rebellion. And the opposition says we shouldn't do that. We should lighten up on them. Say, okay, we agree, no taxation without representation. That would be an easy thing for them to have done. Say, okay, the colonies can have representation in Parliament. Imagine that. There are about 15 million people in England, 3 million people in America. You're probably going to have maybe 3 or 4 representatives in a body of 400. So you do have representation, but they're not actually going to be able to do anything. Wouldn't that have taken all of the moral high ground away from the colonists? You can think about any number of different steps that the ministry could have done to avoid having the colonies push toward independence. And Samuel Adams probably didn't want that to happen. And things the colonists could have done differently that would have wound up much differently.
Okay. I like it when you answer questions with things I mentioned in class. I like the affirmation.
Oh, good. We haven't coordinated this ahead of time.
Yes, we haven't. But great minds,
Yeah, that's true.
Based upon what you just mentioned, Hannah's got a question, and it's multiple, but I'm just going to give you the first part of it. Based on all the facts that occurred during this time period, which one do you think would have changed history if it didn't happen?
That's a terrific question. Well, of course, any one of them would have. And there are lots of things we don't know. Let's suppose the soldiers were convicted and hanged. Well, here's another one. This is actually really an interesting one, because here is something that didn't happen, but might have. April the 21st was typically celebrated in England as the King's birthday. And April 21st of 1775, the British soldiers occupying Boston were going to have a big party at Faneuil Hall. Now they're occupying Boston. Faneuil Hall, where the town meeting happened, isn't being used for the town meeting. So they're going to have a fancy dress ball at Faneuil Hall and celebration. Some of the Sons of Liberty are alleged to have planned to put gunpowder in the basement of Faneuil Hall and blow it up while they're having this celebration. Imagine if that had happened. The moral high ground that the colonists had would have been gone, even though they had made this statement about how much they don't like having the British soldiers here. Imagine if they're blowing up this hall where the soldiers and local women who are dating the soldiers happen to be having this celebration. This would have been, I think, an act of terrorism. It doesn't happen. And the reason it doesn't happen is because 3 days earlier, on the 19th of April, General Gage had sent an expeditionary force out to Lexington and Concord to seize the weapons and the gunpowder and the cannon that the colonists are stockpiling there. So that begins the war. And thus they're not able to have this gunpowder planted in Faneuil Hall. So the War for Independence begins with the embattled farmers at Concord Bridge firing the shot heard round the world. And by the way, there's still a dispute in Lexington. There was a shot fired, and apparently not fired either by British troops or by the Lexington militia. And it's still a mystery who fired it. And each side wants to show the other side fired the first shot. We fired after we were fired upon. And so the Americans do have that justification that we were fired on at Lexington and then we fired back. But imagine if that hadn't happened, if Gage hadn't sent that expedition out, and thus the Sons of Liberty were able to blow up Faneuil Hall. It would be a much different story we'd be telling. Anyway, but you'll look more closely, you look at any of these events, you can see ways they could have gone differently. And it's clear you're thinking about that as you're thinking about not just a series of events, but people making choices. Now, is there more to this, Mr. Klapka?
Well, there are a number of good questions. Alla wants to know, how did circumstances that British leaders faced lead their actions toward preventing or stopping the Civil War?
That's another very good question. And partly, when we were talking about taxes earlier, the fact that Britain did have this huge debt from the war, people in Britain are already heavily taxed, and they see the colonists doing well with all of this trade. So why not regulate the trade? In fact, if you're trying to think of this in kind of a big picture, one of the things happening in the 1760s is Parliament is trying to change the way the empire is governed. And Parliament really, for the first time after this war, recognizes that we have an empire and we really should try to govern it. And that's what they are doing, not really reforming the way the empire is governed. And the new king, George III, very much wants to be a patriot king, someone who is involved in political affairs and someone who's looking out for the best interests of his empire. And members of Parliament also are supposed to be looking out for the best interests of the empire. And the empire has a lot of different interests. And the interests of Massachusetts sometimes coincide with the interests of the empire and sometimes don't. And what we see really happening here is Parliament trying to reform the empire and the perceived interests of the empire and the people of Massachusetts diverging. And as Parliament is trying to reform the empire, it means less local control in Massachusetts. And thus it also means that the acts of Parliament are going to be interpreted in Massachusetts, not as ways to reform Parliament, but as ways to restrict our liberty. So that's really the big thing happening here. And Parliament is responding to lots of different interests, and those of Massachusetts or British North America are not that important. Just to be honest with you, if we were sitting around in London in the 1770s talking about the empire or the American colonies, we would be thinking about Massachusetts or probably even Virginia or Pennsylvania. We'd be thinking about Jamaica and Barbados that produce sugar, and that is the thing that produces wealth for the empire. And a lot of members of Parliament also own plantations in Barbados and Jamaica. And we'd also be thinking about the Ohio River Valley. This is where that big war began, what we call the French and Indian War. And it ends with at the beginning, it looked like the French are going to get control of this whole area. and with the native people will drive the English out of British North America. In the end, Britain takes that area, and then the British Crown has this obligation to try to govern it somehow. And they decide, one of the things they decide is we won't allow any more whites to settle west of the Allegheny Mountains. Virginia wanted to sell that land, and the Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers are trading with the Indians out there, and they say, well, why not? That is something that provokes them into thinking maybe our interests and the interests of the British Crown aren't exactly aligned. Thing is, in London, you'd be much more interested in Ohio than in Massachusetts. Don't tell anyone from Massachusetts I'm saying this, by the way. We always think we are the center of things. We now have to follow the Tampa Bay Bucks because you have the greatest quarterback of all time. And
Yeah, your secret's safe with us.
Thank you.
And I just want to say we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to apologize to everybody because I'm not going to be able to get to all of these questions. Some of you asked multiple very good questions, so please don't be offended. But Lucas asked a series of good questions, and I can only pick one. But do you believe the colonies would have ever introduced the idea of separation and independence if Britain were to have listened to the colonists' request?
That's a very good question. And some would have, and some probably not. When Hutchinson in early 1773 says your choice is either submission or independence, he sends that speech off to London thinking people there will be really happy now that he's put them in their place. People there are infuriated because no one had yet been talking about independence. And here he's told them, this is your choice. You either have to submit or you'll be independent. Well, they knew they couldn't submit. And if he's offering this as their only choice, that's what they have to do. Good question. Franklin in 1750 had written an essay on population where he said in 100 years, there will be more English on this side of the Atlantic than the other, but he's still envisioning these British North America as being British North America. In the same way, Canada remains British and Jamaica and Barbados remain British. It's a very good question. I really like these questions, by the way. You've been giving this a lot of thought.
It shows they're at least listening to me in class on occasion and doing their reading. Let me do, because we just have a couple minutes left here, let me do one that's fairly simplistic, but I think it's kind of all-encompassing. Eric wants to know, what was the biggest event, in your opinion, in the American Revolution?
That's a very good question. I always think the year that makes the revolution inevitable is 1773, when you have all of these things happening that I think I've already talked about. Well, I would have to say the declaring independence itself is. And so that's a significant event, a real milestone. But then the most important long-term event probably is the framing of state government, the framing of governments and creating new forms of government. Because we have seen in other revolutions, the easy thing is toppling the bad old regime. The much harder thing is creating a new regime that won't do the exact same things. And that has been the most difficult thing in any revolution. And in the American Revolution, the really significant thing then is the creation of state constitutions, like the Massachusetts Constitution, which I am obliged to tell you is the oldest functioning written constitution in the world. And it sets up a separation of powers between the different branches of government. And in fact, Article 30 of the Declaration of Rights mandates this separation of powers to the end that this will be a government of laws and not of men. As I said, easy thing to do, relatively easy, topple the old regime, much more difficult, create a new regime that isn't going to do the same things.
Okay. To kind of wrap up here, looking at the John Adams point of view on what was the revolution, that the revolution actually in the 15 years before Lexington and Concord, as opposed to the war.
Yeah.
What's your standing on that?
I think to a large degree he's right. But again, we also have to take into effect that Adams wasn't a soldier. And he did also say that the history of the revolution will be one lie from beginning to end. It will be that Dr. Franklin smote the earth and out popped General Washington. Franklin then electrified him, and then the two of them carried on everything. And he, of course, saw that no role for John Adams in that, and a lot of other people in that. So yes, and it's really a revolution in the way people think about their relationship to government that's happening between 1760 and 1775. There are big changes that happened during the war in terms of creating a Continental Army and building these alliances among people of different states. And also some of the challenge to the institution of slavery that begins before the war starts continue during the war. And also the war then leaves us with a big question of how do we pay for all of this? What kind of a government do we create, et cetera? But yeah, the revolution is the more important. And the war does come after. Maybe it's just because all of us here read too much of John Adams, but that's, I think, a pretty apt way of looking at it. And it also helps us kind of to divide up these periods and think about the revolution versus the war. And one of the really significant things about the war, too, is we have the character of Washington emerging from it. Think about this. He's commanded this army that's brought independence. There's really no governing force in place. Rather than simply saying, okay, the army and I will run things, he steps back. He goes back to his farm. In 1783, Benjamin West was painting George III's portrait. West was an American and a portrait artist who was the official painter for the king. And the king says to West, what do you suppose Washington will do now that he's won the war? And very hard for the king to admit that Washington has won the war. And West says, I imagine he'll go back to his farm. And the king says, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. Because who would? Who would hold this power and then step away? And that, I think, is the big thing that emerges from the war, just in terms of the future of American society.
Okay, just trying that down. Okay, thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you,
We'll be back
everyone.
up in about 15
And if you
minutes.
do have, and if they do have questions they want to ask, have them, feel free to email me with them.
I will definitely share that with them. Absolutely. I just want to chit chat with them for a couple minutes.
Very good.
Just to remind them that Monday you've got your assessment, chapter 3 and chapter 4, 20 questions. You'll have 25 minutes to work on that. So please, for those of you that are, guys, quiet please. For those of you that are here, you can see the stuff on the board, but for those of you that are at home, okay, make sure you do crash course number 6, review chapters 3 and 4, reread the chapters. For some of you, that will be a first time experience. Review the chapter outline notes that are printed out, coordinate those, review your step overview of chapters 3 and 4, which are in your modules, and review your own notes, okay? It will be 20 questions, multiple choice, 5 choices on each, so that we will have all of that together. I want to thank everybody. Again, bell's going to ring here in about a minute. And have a safe weekend. And in case you missed out, I'm wearing my Paul Revere Midnight Ride shirt and my Battle Dorchester scarf, which looks like I'm a soccer hooligan, but nonetheless, all that good stuff. And thank you guys. And I apologize. The questions were great, and I didn't, 45. We could have gone another half hour or 45 minutes before we would have gotten them all in. Okay. For those of you in the studio audience at home, you can go ahead and exit now. I got attendance and saw all your names. Okay. Have a good weekend. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. We'll talk to you all later. Yes, ma'am.
One, well, it's 2 parts to work on.
Just put it up on camera. I opened it up. Yeah, it should be fine now. And if it isn't, I'll double check. I'll fix that. Give me those. That'll be fine.
Something to be proud of, though.
Grading papers. Oh, I tell you, I'm just shocked that more people don't want to be teachers. They find out the things I do. It's like, really? You get paid for that? Every day and every way. Thank you, everybody, for being so well behaved. I appreciate your lack of attention. Yeah, that, by the way, there is, there's the fact that Lucas, pardon that, that's not out of the realm, as it were. Right. Bye-bye. See you all later. Break time.
Wait, good. I'm so excited, Mr. Klapka.
I am too. We had a good time last period. Well, things going well. I'm tired. We had we didn't finish up until sundown yesterday. So that made for a short night. When the alarm went off this morning, I could call in sick. And they go, darn, Bob's going to be here today. Can't do that. So it goes. He'll be with us. And there he is, the venerable Dr. Robert Allison. Hi, Neely.
Hi.
How are you?
Pretty good.
Cool. You're not taking the SAT again tomorrow, are you?
Nah, I already took my fair share of
Okay.
it.
Where do we sign up for that?
Hi guys.
Is it online?
Yeah. Oh. Now they've got the other one that's in 2 weeks. That's the PSAT. You can,
Yeah, I have to take that as well.
yeah, the PSAT, you just go see Fitzgerald. Sign up for it. Anyway, I'm wearing everybody will know this, I'm wearing my Paul Revere t-shirt, Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and the Battle of Dorchester Heights scarf, which Bob gave me, South Boston. It's the first victory, or as I claim the first victory. As a matter of fact, he just lived down the street from this. So, I look like a soccer move.
Do we have separate devices?
Hmm?
Do we have separate devices or just be on screen?
You like that?
Do we need to go on here?
I don't know. No, it'll all be here. It'll all be here. I'm gonna go get a bottle of water here. I will be right back. Morning. Morning.
You know the scene. No.
Is that him?
You know the scene from no. Oh.
By that one old abandoned thing.
What?
What a guy. Really looks cool.
Yeah.
Oh, I forgot to do my question.
Oh.
Dude, I mean, I got home at like 7:30. We won,
I was there, yeah.
I'm the long snapper. I go in there with the punt. Dude, they were throwing so many flags. Oh my god. The game would have ended like 30 minutes ago.
DeAndre
I do it with 20. Huh?
You gonna do it the volleyball courts?
I can't go today.
Oh yeah.
My parents won't pick me up.
How about Monday? I know. I did.
Just get
Da,
burned.
da, 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 da.
It is pretty good, but not
It'll
good.
be fun.
Yeah.
Like,
Those people are outside hungry. They're telling
Texas Roadhouse has better bread than.
President and First Lady, huh? Look what happened to them. Anyway, we'll see Gracie, Courtney, Lucas, Donovan.
Oh, no, I thought you were the same thing, mess with it. He said,
Well, that's nice. I have no idea what your people look like, other than old.
why does it look like Lucas?
It does look
This
very
is not like McDonald's.
bad. You can ask for bigger.
Well, I have no idea, but I do know that's what Bob looks like.
That is Bob.
That is picture. Yes, he'll be up in a few minutes. So.
He's just so waiting for me.
There it is.
Just starts talking. Sure did.
We got about half the questions last week because they're really good questions and it's tough. We got 20 in a 40-minute period, so we got through about.
Oh my God, look at Donovan. Because I figured him.
Oh,
I mean, they were twins. Or triplets.
No, that's.
twins, triplets, what the Figueroas, the Fighting Figueroas. Oh goodness. Oh, I'm glad he's here today because I'm tired. Let somebody else do the talking today.
Yeah, I remember his back then. I was like, I gotta go.
What I was saying earlier, you know, because we didn't finish. I mean, the tournament ended at Sunday. Yeah, so like 7 o'clock or about. And I would have been angry if it hadn't been through beautiful sunset. But I got when the alarm went off this morning, I'm like, I could just call in sick. And they go, no, I can't because Bob's on it. So, plus, I was sweating bullets trying to get a sick for yesterday. So,
I got home at 10:30 last night.
where's my attendance?
I gotta make sure, like when I pull off, and it doesn't go off.
Okay. Oh, I gotta say that. Okay.
Yeah, I did. They just want you to do attendance, that's pretty much it.
Here we go. Guys, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have something to write on.
I feel like, why the heck did you just call me?
Just because I'm kind of, crazy that way where something that Dr. Allison mentions, I might just pop in on the assessment.
Well, we're taking notes anyways, hopefully.
Oh
my God, he just logged on, Mr. Klapka.
There he is. Everybody say hi, Dr. Allison. Boy, that was enthusiastic. That's good.
Hi.
Hello. So you said this was the
Okay.
smarter class?
We'll give this a couple more minutes. We got a few people at home that haven't quite checked in yet, so. Courtney checked in early though.
So creepy. Wait, is my sound?
Hi Sadie, we can hear you.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. I was just telling everybody here that those of you that might want to take out a sheet of paper, take notes on this. I should say you already have a multi-volume work of notes already, and we're only 5 weeks in, so I'm sure you just need to add this to it. Courtney came in on the tail end of the last one there, so. Okay. Let's just give it a couple more minutes here and we'll get things started. Just as a note, for those of you that are here, you can see yourself. And people want to know why I'm losing my hearing. On the board, those of you here, just remind you, make sure you get crash course number 6 done. Review chapters 3 and 4. Reread, review both the chapter, the outline notes, the STEM overview for chapter 3 and 4, and of course your own notes. All those things will come handy. You have 20 questions, 25 minutes, all that sort of good stuff. I'm sure you'll do well. And now we're waiting for Victoria's iPhone to come in. Okay. Okay, so everybody, this is Dr. Allison, my middle school, actually we called it junior high back then.
Yeah.
We are alums of both Oak Grove and Clearwater High. Oh, no booze this time. This is good. Okay. And I'm going to let Dr. Allison introduce himself. And then what the format is going to be very simple. I've got a stack of really great. I am tired. Great questions today. And we're going to go through this. And again, I want to apologize in advance. We are not going to be able to get these questions, so please don't be offended if I don't ask yours. And of course, at any point, if you have a question, neither Dr. Allison or I will be offended if you interrupt and say, "Can I ask you something?" Okay? So, and you don't necessarily have to do anything but just say, "Excuse me," and then go in. Okay. So, Bob, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Mr.
We'll take it from there.
Great, thank you, Mr. Klapka. And if you have a really good question you're dying to know, we don't get to it, you can email me, and Mr. Klapka can provide my email address. I'm happy to correspond with you, not during your test on Monday, but for that, after that. This is something I love to talk about. And as you said, we both met many years ago in middle school or junior high school, and then at Clearwater High, and both of us loved history. We also had a great history teacher who really inspired us, and we both went our separate ways, but actually a similar way into teaching history. He's been doing it with great distinction there for decades, and I've been for about 30 years teaching at Suffolk University.
Yeah, he's only got 30 years in. I got 10 years on him. He's still a newbie. So
that's right. I'm still learning, and so I'm happy to be in Mr. Klapka's class. So I teach at Suffolk, which was a college in Boston, as well as in Harvard's Extension School, which is a night school Harvard has, which actually is where I earned my undergraduate degree before then getting a PhD at Harvard. So
yeah, it's too bad you had to get your degree from Harvard and not go to like South Florida like I did. But
yeah, that's true. We all make choices, and the choices is actually what history is all about, because we're looking at people making different choices. So that's what I hope we'll be talking about for the next few minutes. So let's hear your questions.
Okay, let me start with the first one here. And this is kind of an overarching question, and this is Sophia's question. Was it primarily economic or social ideas that spurred the revolution?
Wow, that is a great question. And there are scholars, generations of scholars who have been looking at that very thing. And I should warn you that typically they break down and either looking at economic factors or social factors. I happen to study under someone whose real interest was the ideological factors. That is, what were people thinking? But you can see pieces of all of this. You know, there is the fact that the colonies were becoming, they did have their own kind of economic network, economic system, but they were part of a British economic system. And one of the things that triggers the British policies in the 1760s is trying to figure out how to govern this empire. And so the British are passing a series of essentially tax laws to try to regulate trade in the colonies. And you're going to see colonists resisting this, but with two kind of related but somewhat different motives. One is, we don't want to have to pay taxes. And the other is, what gives them the power to govern us in this way? And I don't think you can really separate these two. And one of the really interesting things to me about the revolution is it takes this direction from, on one hand, group of merchants involved in the sugar trade not liking the sugar tax, then to a general revolution for personal liberty, which is going to extend to everyone, even the people producing the sugar. That is, the revolution is not, as one historian said about 100 years ago, simply a quarrel over who would govern at home, but it really was something much more, which is what makes it much more interesting. I'm sure I probably just dodged answering the question, was it economic or social factors? It was some of both. And I think you do need to take all of them into account.
Okay, Neelay wants to know, and again, good questions. Why was Boston a valuable area for trade and commerce from a political standpoint?
Another very good question. Boston was the leading North American port into the early 18th century. And one of the reasons for that is, Boston, unlike other colonies, didn't have any raw material they could export or any kind of resources that were valuable. So they really had to make do with what they had. Not a very good climate for growing things or for farming. They do have a lot of lumber, so they make ships, and they're near a big fishing ground, so they can harvest, catch codfish and salt them down. And then trade is then the thing that's going to motivate Bostonians. They're engaged with trade with the rest of the world, with the Madeira Islands and with the Mediterranean, as well as with the West Indies. And the most important, and Bostonians are trading with the West Indies, bringing up sugar and molasses, turning them into rum, as well as other things, and then also shipping the codfish down to the West Indies. By the way, if we were sitting around in London in the 1760s and 70s talking about our colonies or our empire, we really wouldn't be thinking about Boston at all. We'd be thinking about Barbados and Jamaica, or India, which the East India Company had recently taken over, because these look like really valuable colonial enterprises. Boston's place is in shipping things. And that's really something that comes out of necessity, because they don't have anything else worthwhile to sell. They're not producing tobacco the way Virginia is, or rice the way South Carolina is, and they don't have as good farmland as Pennsylvania does. New York has the trade with the Iroquois and the fur trade, which is really what is most valuable to New York. New England doesn't have those things, but what it does have is the ability to produce good ships close to fishing grounds. And also people tend to have large families, which means they have a lot of available people to go to become merchant sailors or merchants.
Okay, next question. Let's get to the Boston Massacre. Let's use good use of your background there. Elizabeth wants to know, on March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre took place. Not many died, but it got the attention of many colonists. If the British soldiers had not fired or had been the ones who died, would there have been a different outcome in terms of reaction, I guess is what she's asking here.
Definitely.
And did the Boston Massacre really have an impact on the overall outcome of boycotts and patriot movements?
Wow. These are terrific questions. I really wish some of you would come to Suffolk and ask us these kinds of questions. I feel like
if you arrange for the bus, we'll come up.
This is terrific. Yeah, I think when the troops first arrived in 1768, there were predictions that there was going to be trouble. Benjamin Franklin said, sending troops to keep the peace in Boston is like setting up a blacksmith's forge and a gunpowder magazine. But there really isn't. There had been a big, what's called a massacre in London in 1768, the St. George's Field Massacre. And in many ways, the propagandists in Boston are drawing a connection with that by calling this the massacre. And we know the soldiers were under attack. At least that's what the jury says and what the evidence, to my mind, seems to indicate. And this drawing behind, engraving behind me, really is misrepresenting what happened. You know, let me just see if I can show you something quickly here while we're on this subject, if Mr. Klapka doesn't object.
Well, you're in control, so there's not a whole lot of.
Okay, well, that's heartening. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Here you see on, I think on the left, Paul Revere's engraving, the bloody massacre. And here you can see, let me see if I can do the, you know, the soldiers are standing here practically, I meant to stay here, practically in the middle of the street. And here you have the townspeople, fairly well-dressed group who are, you know, and here's someone's out walking their dog. And then behind, in the background, you have the State House. This is the seat of the provincial government. And here is the first church. This is the ecclesiastical power in the town of Boston. So they're looming, or you can think about any number of different ways that the artist could have framed this. And actually, Henry Pelham was the artist who originally did this scene, and he brings his engraving. I don't know if I have his engraving here. No, to Revere, to have Revere make prints of so that Pelham can sell them. And instead of simply making prints of Pelham's engraving, Revere changes it a bit, includes ads down here at the bottom, engraved, printed, and sold by Paul Revere. But you can see this perspective. You're looking at the seats of political power, ecclesiastical power, and then here in the street are these armed men seizing power. And in fact, Pelham called his engraving the fruits of arbitrary power. And that's really what this is about. That's what the revolution is really about, is power. The building they're standing in front of is the Customs House, which you'll see Revere has labeled Butcher's Hall. And then here you see a gun firing out of the Customs House because the townspeople, about 5 townspeople in giving deposition said, "I thought I saw a flash coming out of the Customs House." And the sentry was in front of the Customs House to protect it because the reason the townspeople were upset wasn't necessarily because of the soldiers, but because of the customs duties. So that's kind of the broad overview. And then look at this scene over here, if you can see it. These things that look like lollipops are the soldiers. This is the crime scene sketch done for the court. So they want to get an accurate account of what happened. Look at how close these guys are to the Custom House compared to here. Here they're practically in the middle of the street. And here you see they're really pressed against the Customs House. And look at the distance here between them and the townspeople. And look at the distance here between them and the victims, Gray and addicts, and then a pretty big crowd if there are people over here getting wounded. And it's really a very different picture you get looking at this crime scene and the Revere engraving. To me, one of the really striking things here is that Paul Revere actually did both of these. He was the engraver of this scene, and he was the guy who did the crime scene sketch for the court, which gives you a very different perspective. And of course, the town wants to make sure you have this perspective, the Revere perspective, which is why when they print up their account of this, which they call the account of the horrid massacre, that's the frontispiece. That is the way they want this to be remembered. And it becomes the way we remember because of this engraving. At the trial of the soldiers, one of the judges talks about the copper plate engravings that have inflamed the public mind and given us a false idea of what happened. It should caution us always to look at the evidence very carefully, because here's this scene. This is the best known scene of the American Revolution, and it's really wrong in so many ways. But the people who are creating it want to create a certain image of the peaceful, law-abiding colonists being gunned down by these troops. And look, in the background is Captain Preston giving the order to fire, which the evidence is he didn't give the order to fire. And so this is one of the things that makes it puzzling, but it also should warn us about, listening to the first story that comes out about some horror that happened. And here you have, there's a reason that Revere and Samuel Adams want to present this particular story.
Okay, just to stay on that for a moment, Anissa wants to know, without the uses of propaganda, do you think that the Boston Massacre would have gained less national attention?
Oh, definitely it is. There was a similar event in New York a few weeks before at Golders Hill, and British soldiers tried to take down the Liberty Pole, and there was some resistance, and it really is the town's ability. And by the way, March the 5th becomes a date the town commemorates every year, March the 5th. It becomes this date. In fact, in 1776, Washington oversees the fortifications at Dorchester Heights, which Mr. Klapka's scarf indicates. And the men finished the fortifications on the night of March the 4th. And Washington knows the British are going to come and attack, and he asks if these men of Boston will allow the British to triumph on the 5th of March. And of course, they all understand what the 5th of March is. And they won't, of course. And every year the town has commemorations. People illuminate their windows with scenes of the horrid massacre and with scenes of, liberty and the death of Christopher Sider, an 11-year-old boy who was killed in a similar riot a couple of weeks earlier. So yeah, the town makes it their active intent to commemorate this event. It's one of the reasons we do remember some things and not others. Because it's not simple. We don't remember everything, as you know. I mean, you've been studying history now, and you know how much there is to remember, and some things you are going to forget, unless you make it a point of remembering, which is what Samuel Adams wants to make sure they do. The following year, on March the 5th, Governor Hutchinson happens to be writing a letter, and he hears the church bells tolling, because all the church bells in Boston are tolling in commemoration. And he says, this shows how badly they remember, badly they understand what actually happened.
Okay, just to kind of dovetail on that, because a lot of people, we're talking about Boston and the massacre. Graciela, I'm just going to cut her question here because you've already answered the first part of it. But why did the British over-exaggerate the events of the Boston Massacre, painting the image that the British were a bad people? And how did this affect the political views of the colonists and the British? And why did the Patriots refer to the coercive acts as intolerable?
All very good questions, and they're all related to this point of trying to present things in the best possible way for your side. So the coercive acts, we call them intolerable because we can't take them. And that's, it really is a case of trying to frame the debate in a way that is of best use to you. It's something that, of course, politicians do today. And it's something, this whole period can really make us think about that, because here you see this image distorting what happened and changing the way we think about it and the way we name things. So I'm not going to talk about any current events, but you often see a bill named something that makes it sound really palatable. Here's an example. In 1893, the Louisiana legislature passed a law called an Act for the Comfort and Safety of Railroad Passengers. It was an act mandating racial segregation in trains. They don't call it an act to segregate people by race, but an act to promote the safety. Well, who's going to be against comfort and safety of passengers or other things? So just if you learn nothing else, you'll learn a lot from Mr. Klapka. But one thing we learn from history is always to be careful of what people call things. Or if you go into politics, always be careful of what you do call things, because that has a great impact.
Semantics matter. So
Exactly.
okay, let's shift to something a little less violent. Let's see. Leanna wants to know, why did the colonists think that the Boston Tea Party was going to be helpful when it backfired, and with the British enforcing the intolerable acts?
Well, now that is a very good question. And I think if I were one of the people behind the Boston Tea Party, I would say, You might be right in the short term that yes, the British do enforce the Intolerable Act, shut down the port of Boston, and that could have been the end of it. But the colonists respond by standing with Massachusetts and continuing to resist. I think, you're really onto something, that it is that year that is the year things would have gone much differently had things not happened that year that did, and had the two sides not reacted in the way they did. So yeah, short term, no, Parliament doesn't back down. Long term, without the Boston Tea Party and without the reaction to it, independence would not have happened. So that, I think, is another way of looking at it. It's really a good question, because we're thinking, okay, so Parliament doesn't say, gee, we were wrong. Hey, we're going to suspend the Tea Act. They get tough. But the reaction to Parliament getting tough is more resistance. And actually, not an insignificant thing is Parliament gets the news about the destruction of the tea in mid-January of 1774, just before the Privy Council hearing that Benjamin Franklin had arranged to inquire into what was happening in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Assembly wanted the Privy Council to replace Governor Thomas Hutchinson. And so they would have a hearing of Massachusetts' reasons for wanting to get rid of Hutchinson. By the time the Privy Council meets, no one in the Privy Council or in London is really very much interested in what these people in Massachusetts are interested in, because they've just destroyed 1.9 million pounds worth of tea, which belonged to the East India Company, which belonged actually to Parliament at this time. So Massachusetts has just destroyed all of this property that belonged to the East India Company, and now here they are whining about Thomas Hutchinson. The Privy Council hearing becomes a 2-hour tour de force by Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General, attacking Benjamin Franklin. Franklin had arranged this meeting hoping that if someone other than Hutchinson were governor, he could appease the people of Massachusetts and keep them within the empire. That is, his purpose was to save the empire. And after this hearing, which is this great dramatic event with Wedderburn castigating Franklin, for a variety of reasons, saying he's not content with being here as the agent of a provincial assembly. Instead, he imagines himself the ambassador of an independent empire. The result is Franklin comes away thinking the empire is not worth saving. Not an insignificant thing. Franklin trying to save the empire. Remember, his son is the governor of New Jersey, but now he is on the other side. And that's not an insignificant thing. That is, the destruction of the tea brings attention to the fact that Parliament and the company really are trying to govern these colonies. They're doing it badly. And by the way, there is a resistance in England to this, an opposition party, which thinks that the British government really is botching things. And there's an election in 1774, which the opposition very nearly wins. And had they won, they probably would have changed all of these policies and would have given self-government to the colonies, possibly. In 1778, the Parliament does send a commission to America to see if they would be interested in this. And by this time, the war really had changed the dynamics, and no one's really interested in things that would have saved the empire in 1774. By 1778, there's very few people here are going to say, yeah, why don't we go back to being part of the British Empire? It's a terrific question about this event, but you think we need to look at the short term and long term. Maybe some people thought immediately, okay, Parliament's going to suspend the Tea Act. I think Samuel Adams was playing a longer game here, and knowing the other side is going to counter with something, how will we respond to that?
Okay, here's an interesting one. This is from Grace. How did the geographical location of Boston impact the Revolution?
Well, that's another very good question. And one thing the British realize very quickly when they're occupying Boston is this is not a good place from which to win back the loyalty of the American people. And because Boston, it really is the major city of New England and shares this culture with New England. And it is, the climate, as I think I said, isn't that good for growing anything. So they had turned to shipping. And it's also close to Canada. For most of the 18th century, when the British and French empires were at war, Boston was on the front lines. the people do have this, they're more ethnically homogeneous than people in the other colonies. There are enslaved people in Boston, as well as free Black people, but most of the population are of English descent, as opposed to Scots-Irish, German, or other people of other ethnicities you find in the other colonies. So that makes it kind of insular in one way, and in a big way. And it also means that there's a certain cohesiveness here. And the British, as I said, who are occupying Boston, realize this isn't a good place to try to win back the loyalty. Their suspicion is that people in the other colonies want to remain loyal. They might have some hotheads here and there, but they think a place like South Carolina would be much more receptive to remaining part of the empire because they're very different from New England. Similarly, Pennsylvania and New York and New Jersey, a lot more loyalists in those places. Virginia is kind of a different case. So the British idea is, well, if we get out of Massachusetts, then we can shore up our support in these other places. But their problem is really a political one. That is, you have a British army occupying Boston to put down a rebellion, which we say is kind of localized. If they just leave Boston, people in England will say, well, wait a minute, we thought you were there to win back the loyalty, but now you're giving up. So they know they have to stay there. And it's really the cannon placed at Dorchester Heights that give them a pretext for leaving. I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but it's a very good one because these different parts of the American colonies are very different from each other. And another piece of British thinking is there's really very little likelihood that New England and the Carolinas will find enough common ground that they'll want to be part of this same entity. And it's right. I mean, it did take nearly a century to bring these places together. And, you know, we always are reminded how fractious the Union is. It's not until the Civil War that people will refer to the United States as a singular, that is, the United States is, as opposed to the United States are. And people would still think about their region or their province or colony or state as their home or even their country, as opposed to thinking about the entire United States as their country. You know, there are some who do, but these kind of local identities persist in very big ways.
Okay, another Boston question, another interesting point of view. This is from Courtney. Courtney wants to know how much of Boston took the side of and shared the opinions of the rioters / protesters, which I guess is depending on where you're standing.
It does, and that is a very good, it's an excellent question. And the short answer is we don't know and never will know. On the other hand, I think there was more unity in Massachusetts than in other places. And, you know, we can measure this in some way by those who choose to remain loyal. And there are far fewer loyalists in Massachusetts than in other places. In April of 1776, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress asked the towns, and each town is governed by a town meeting where every adult tax-paying man over 21, Protestant too, votes. And the town meetings were asked, if we were to consider independence, how should we vote? And every town in Massachusetts votes for it, except one, and that's the town of Barnstable on Cape Cod. So you see that, which probably would have been unlikely in other places. Also, yeah, and also there had been a long period before this where people who were showing that they were loyal were being ostracized, pressured, and so on. And in 1776, when the British evacuate, they take with them about 1,100 loyalists. And in some cases, some towns do lose significant numbers, but it's a much higher percentage of people agreeing. Now, here, one of the problems is with, say, an event like this, middle-class people, people like me aren't going to be out in the street doing these kinds of things. And so one thing that this engraving is trying to do is to show this isn't a lawless mob made up of, sailors and longshoremen. It's a pretty respectable group. And it's trying to draw that connection. At the trial of the soldiers in the fall, John Adams really draws a different picture of this mob. Outlandish Jack Tars and outsiders, a car from Ireland, an addicts from Framingham, that is showing these really are outsiders. It's really a fascinating thing. And it's a question really that Adams sees of power. And if the mob has power, what kind of safety is there for the rule of law? So you can see a division of opinion on, we really don't like troops firing at unarmed civilians. On the other hand, we really don't like the mob basically deciding we do like this law or don't like that public official, so we'll turn out and demonstrate against them. It's one reason the trial is helpful in appeasing people. Also, the destruction of the tea, or the Tea Party, I know you've heard about. And when the news first arrived that the tea was coming, a mob goes and attacks the house of one of the tea merchants, Richard Clark. They tear the shingles off, tear the shutters off, break the glass of the windows, the kinds of things they were used to doing. In 1765, remember, they had torn down the house of the governor, Governor Hutchinson, and tore down the warehouse of his brother-in-law. And then they're doing the same thing with the tea. But after this, they rein things in. I think they realize, the leaders understand, that's really going to alienate people if we use that same kind of tactic. So instead, we will operate with the utmost decorum. And so the destruction of the tea is really carried out without destroying anything else. One of the masters of the ship, when the group disguised as Indians comes aboard, they say, want to destroy the tea. He says, start with another ship because I still have a cargo on top of the tea. They say, we'll unload that. And they do very carefully unload this other cargo, put it on the dock, which is where he had wanted it. And then they, bring up the chests of tea, cut them open, throw the tea overboard. We're just destroying the tea and nothing else. On one of the ships, someone breaks a lock. They send someone into town for a locksmith to repair it, because they want to make clear we're not destroying anything other than the tea. And this is really a peaceful protest. Destruction of property, yes, but a peaceful protest. So they really are trying, in this case, to keep the kind of the center of opinion on their side. And you're not going to do that by, setting fire to the ships or doing other things that would have just demonstrated their righteous anger.
Okay, let's get into an individual here. And I'm wearing my Paul Revere Midnight Ride shirt. So Donovan wants to know, how and why is Paul Revere a significant character to the idea of revolution in Boston?
That is a very good question. And let me—
He's smiling right now, he's happy, so.
Let me recommend, when you are out of the burden of having Mr. Klapka telling you what to read, pick up David Hackett Fisher's book, Paul Revere's Ride. Revere is involved in a lot of things. And actually at the end of Fisher's book, he has an appendix. And one of the things he has is a list of all of the organizations in Boston that are involved in some way with what becomes the revolution. The Sons of Liberty, the Loyal Nine, the Committees of Safety, participants in the Tea Party. It's like 7 or 8 organizations, and he has a list of maybe 200 people. Some of their names will be familiar to you and some won't. But the point is, each of these 200 people belonged to at least one of these organizations. Many of them belong to 2. Only a few dozen belong to 3 or 4, and only 2 belong to all of them. And those 2 are Joseph Warren and Paul Revere. So Revere is involved in a lot of things. And he's a silversmith, coppersmith. This is why he's engraving things like this. He's a coppersmith. He has sheets of copper. He's not an artist. He is an artist with silver. And so he is meeting people as part of his business, but he's also involved, and he's a member of the North End Caucus, and he's a member of the Masons, and the Masons were a very important group in this. And so he is someone who has connections with tradespeople. That is, he is someone who works with his hands, as opposed to someone like John Hancock, who is a merchant, or Samuel Adams, who's kind of a politician. And Revere works with his hands, and he also acts as a messenger. So he is the one creating propaganda pieces like this and others. In fact, you'll find other things that Revere does in terms of creating propaganda, but also as a messenger. And so it is this connections he makes with others. And the fact that people do respect him enough to make him the leader of things, like he is the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge after Joseph Warren dies. And he has a few military commands that don't end very well, not really through his work, but he is also a very good entrepreneur. And the reason I think the reason he's remembered is, of course, because of Longfellow's poem that he wrote in 1860 or 61. But I've actually just been doing a project on the USS Constitution, a ship in Boston. Revere actually did the copper work that lines its hull. In fact, he built the first copper rolling mill in the country to make these sheets of copper that would line the hull of the Constitution, as well as the dome of the State House. In 1845, the American consul in Singapore was married to Paul Revere's daughter, and many of the members of the ship go and visit the consul and Maria Revere Ballister, and they all knew who Paul Revere was. Our thinking had been that before 1861, no one really had heard of Paul Revere. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow goes to see the Old North Church and thinks about that story that you might have known if you grew up around here, the story of Paul Revere being the guy who gives the warning. But here in 1845, everyone knows Paul Revere. They know him both as the patriot as well as the industrialist. He's one of the first great entrepreneurs in building an ironworks, also making bells. Singapore, by the way, is the only place outside the United States where you can find a bell cast by the Revere Company. And by the way, until fairly recently, there was a Revere company that made pots and pans, copper lined on the bottom. And that was a company that Revere founded, actually the descendant of the company that Revere started. So, sometimes you look at someone and say, well, why is he remembered as opposed to someone else? It's one of the things Fisher is getting at in his book. There's good reason that Revere should be remembered, aside, of course, from the poem. And Mr. Klapka did tell me that your next assignment is to memorize The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, so you'll all be able to carry that with you for the rest of your lives.
Forgetting, I had a classmate at Belcher Elementary who memorized that in the 5th grade.
Wow.
God bless her.
I memorized it about 2 years ago, and it's probably would have been easier in the 5th grade, but
Yeah,
I'm not going to
probably.
recite it.
Okay, Ashley thinks we're getting a little talking too much about the men, so let's get from patriarchy to matriarchy. How do the sons of liberty and the daughters of liberty relate to one another, and how did the daughters of liberty create an impact on society?
Wow, what a good question, and thank you for asking that, Ashley. I think because of the world we live in, we don't see women in this period having a political role because they weren't running for office, but they do. And women are involved in a lot of things. Shopkeepers, a lot of women own shops or keep boarding houses or do other things. In fact, a few years ago at Harvard, they discovered during the boycott, people were asked to sign this boycott agreement that we're not going to buy or sell any British goods. And there are about 600 names on this list. 200 of them are women. And women were owning shops. In many cases, too, they are the ones doing the purchasing. And another thing the Daughters of Liberty do is organize spinning bees. Remember, we're trying to get away from purchasing British goods. So one thing we can do is produce our own. So hundreds of women would gather on the town commons to spin. Many of them weren't very good at spinning. There's a myth that every woman had a spinning wheel. Not true. But they're doing this as a public way of showing their support for the cause. And women accompany the army during the war. And in fact, Massachusetts has an official state heroine, Deborah Sampson, who dresses as a man and joins the Continental Army. But you have women participating in all these ways, even though they don't vote in the town meetings. They usually are the members of churches, and there they play a really significant role. Even though the men are the ones on the governing boards, the churches wouldn't exist without women. There are a couple of really good books on this. One by Carol Birkin, Revolutionary Mothers, which is well worth reading because, you know, even though women aren't voting, running for office, they are doing things that are really essential to this cause, even though in many ways they've been written out of the story. Marla Miller has written a great book about Betsy Ross. It's a myth that Betsy Ross made the flag, but Betsy Ross was a very successful entrepreneur in Philadelphia who was an upholsterer. That is, she made upholstery. So she's used to working with fabric. It's not implausible that she designed the flag. And one thing, Washington wanted to have a 6-pointed star. Betsy Ross, who was used to cutting pieces of fabric, showed him how you make many fewer cuts if you do a 5-pointed star. Because she's someone who was used to doing this kind of work. So women are involved in this, integral to this, and also worked as printers. Franklin trained a lot of printers, and if the printer died, often his wife would take over. So one of my favorite copies of the Declaration is the one that was printed in Baltimore in January 1777. And it's the first one that has all the names of the signers printed on it. And then at the very bottom, it says, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard, Baltimore, Maryland. So the thing I like about it too, it has a woman's name at the bottom. She is the one who set the type. So women are involved in all of this, as well as involved as mothers, sisters, spouses. And that's, I guess, a story for another day.
Okay. Lucas wants to know what factor or factors and or events other than the Stamp Act do you think played a role in the start of the American Revolution?
Well, that is a terrific question. As I think I said, the year 1773 seems to me to be the critical one. Because you look at it, you say, okay, these whole things led to the revolution. Well, how come Stamp Act 1765 and then the revolution doesn't happen? One thing that happens is the Stamp Act is repealed, but Parliament, in repealing it, passes the Declaratory Act, declaring we have the power to govern the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Benjamin Franklin said that's a wise piece of legislation only if no one ever tries to enforce it. And it is these other attempts by Parliament to enforce. And as we were saying earlier, it's not simply the action, it's the reaction then. And, you know, so don't look at these as discrete events. If you read the Declaration of Independence, they're not really listed in order. They're listed in order of importance. And they're called this long train of abuses and usurpations, as you have these different events that add up to something, as opposed to one big cause. You know, we saw with Arab Spring, this vendor in Tunisia burning himself to death. And this is what triggers then the Arab Spring. You're not going to find an event like that triggering this, like, you know, this scene here. It's this long train of things as people like Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren, Patrick Henry are building this argument that this is the intent of the British government, to enslave us. And then it's introducing this idea of slavery being a bad thing. You know, on the one hand, we can say, what a bunch of hypocrites, because they own slaves. In fact, Samuel Johnson, a British man of letters, said, how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? But this reaction against slavery for us also leads to a reaction against slavery for others. And one of the really important things to come out of the American Revolution, even though slavery persists, as you see, attacks on the institution during the course of it. You know, so the Massachusetts Constitution, which has very similar language to other constitutions about all men being born free and equal, leads to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts because of that very language, which they knew meant something. You know, it would be easy in the Declaration simply to say, hey, we don't like these British tax policies, but they begin with this statement about all men being created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain rights. And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, the people have a right to alter or abolish it. As they're making this statement, and Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration, wasn't trying to advance some new idea. He's trying to create something everyone can agree on. These are self-evident truths, the Declaration calls them. So this becomes really the profound thing about how it is this multitude of different actions, reactions that then leads to this, the Declaration, and the Declaration grounded in certain things is a way of creating this common identity. As I said, Massachusetts is different in being ethnically homogeneous, but here you have to create this movement that will create one body out of these very different people.
Okay, we're gonna have to cut it there because the bell's gonna ring here in about a minute. Time flies when we're having fun. Just a quick point, everybody. Please make sure you prepare for the assessment on Monday. Okay, everybody say thank you to Dr. Allison.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bob, always a pleasure.
It was fun.
Thank you for all your help. And you have a good weekend and say hello to Phyllis for us.
I will. Hello to Sharon. Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Will
And,
do. Thank you, sir.
and hope the rest of your
Everybody
classes
else,
go well today.
Yeah, those of you in the home audience, you can go ahead and take off. Be
Take
prepped.
care.
And thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Okay.
What is that?